I Care If You Listen is an editorially independent program of the American Composers Forum offering interviews, critical reviews, and short form essays covering the contemporary classical, new, and experimental music scenes. With an express focus on artists from historically marginalized communities, I Care If You Listen seeks to provide a safe and equitable space for artists to share their work and discuss the broader social and cultural landscapes. I Care If You Listen maintains a dedicated international readership and has cultivated a trusted global reputation as a leading source for new music news in the United States. Learn more and check out the latest at icareifyoulisten.com. I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY, the podcast built to decolonize classical music. Appreciate your tuning in as always, and appreciate your continued support. You can check out past opuses of the TRILLOQUY podcast, learn more about our contributors, and donate to the effort online at TRILLOQUY, TRILLOQY.org. I don't know if y'all heard, but a few weeks ago, there was a protest at the Metropolitan Opera. Pearls were clutched and online discussions were had. I'll offer my thoughts in today's TRILLOQUY, but for now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, composer Mehmet Ali Sanlıkol. Mehmet is a Turkish-born musician who's studied everything from Western classical to jazz, and as we'll be discussing today, music inspired by traditional Sufi traditions, as heard on his new album, Lessons from Nightingales. If you aren't familiar with Sufism, or you don't know what a dervish is or a whirling dervish, I've included a link in the description of this opus for you to check out. Mehmet has done a beautiful job not only creating music born from these unique traditions, but he's also created a pathway for folks who aren't familiar to learn more about it in a way that I'll say is beautifully composed. This album features the Blue Heron Choir of Massachusetts alongside Mehmet and friends offering instrumental flavorings. Really great music that I hope you'll dive into when you get the chance. Here's a sample of what's on the album to get us into our chat. This track is subtitled The Revelation, one of my favorite moments within this body of work. Hope you enjoyed this music and my conversation with Mehmet. More from me on the other side.
First of all, like many other forms of mysticism, unfortunately, Sufism too can become subject to commercial spirituality. So I want to put that out there right away because obviously my connection to Sufism is something that is very personal, that is tied to my identity and everything. And because I grew up in Turkey, and when growing up, my mom would take me at times, to some tomb of a local Sufi saint, so that we would go pray and ask for some wishes to be granted, etc. And so I grew up with all of that around me. Not that I took it seriously up until much later in life.
Mm-hmm.
And my family was really they were secular Muslims. They were not really practicing Muslims. The my only experiences in the mosque, the mainstream form of Islam, would be a couple of nights during the Ramadan, for example, when my dad would insist that we would go uh, to the mosque, and not because he felt that that was again us being good Muslims, but it was literally because we would connect with the community,
Hmm.
and so it was more about not becoming outcasts. And so they were absolutely not steady, like meaning one year we would go twice, the next year we would not at all, so my so but I came to really truly discover Sufism, in fact, much later, more like 7 years after my arrival in the United States, when I finally started studying and working on Turkish music,
Hmm.
and that quickly connected with Sufism. Sufism is Islamic mysticism. If we are able to, if and when we are able to surpass, those forms of it that has been commercialized, etc., it is in fact in some way a deeper, the spiritual aspect of Islam that is disengaged from the mainstream. In some ways, it is the side of Islam that is that it protests against the mainstream. But with all of that said, Sufism is on a huge spectrum.
Hmm.
There are orders, there are brotherhoods that come very close to the mainstream. And then there are those orders or brotherhoods that are very far away. There's extremely heterodox, and I suppose some of those Turkish brotherhoods that I connect with are those that are really on the liberal end of things.
Sure, sure. Wow,
So
wow.
I guess in a nutshell, that's what I would say.
So as I consider the Sufism that has inspired
Mhm.
much of the music on Lessons from Nightingales, as I listened through, I couldn't help but to sort of think about ritual. If we listen to, for example, a requiem, there's certain histories that are connected to that form and what we're engaging. Is there something similar for listeners as they engage Lessons from Nightingales?
Well, yes. I mean, Sufi orders will have, the so-called dervishes, right? Dervishes are practitioners of Sufism, and they're kind of like monks, I suppose. Although they were less secluded, they were more connected with people than monks in monasteries. Overall, there are exceptions, of course, but dervishes did have and still do have rituals that they would perform. The most famous one, I guess, is in fact of a Turkish order, the so-called whirling dervishes. Their real
Mhm.
name is Mevlevi dervishes. Their whirling ritual is in fact a ritual. I'd go so far as calling it a spiritual ballet, in fact.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And that is imagery that I think people, if they don't know it by your
Mhm.
description, if they were to see it, it is something that is very familiar. That's beautiful. Thank you. So for
Yeah.
people who have zero context for the culture connected to lessons of Nightingales, what do you hope that they get away from this? Is taking in the aesthetic enough?
Well, I mean, we can divide that into two parts. We can say that, on a more practical level, hopefully they'll be moved enough to go research.
Sure.
That's the more practical desire. On a more deeper level, first of all, Sufism or Sufi mysticism, uh, even including those amazing, the greatest poets that have walked the earth, like Rumi,
Hmm.
who was a Sufi mystic, even he said that music is more powerful than words. Okay. But what kind of music? Of course, he's talking about, you know, um, instrumental music, without words. And I think his examples were of, for example, the rebab, a melody that is performed on an instrument
Hmm.
like the rebab, which is a spike fiddle. Uh, if the soul is ready, then it may trigger something deep inside that may then result in an awakening of sorts. In fact, it is true. Think about those moments in life when we suddenly, come to a realization. It is in fact an instant, something that ticks. So that's what a lot of Sufi masters would refer to as a moment of realization. And so words, they can, yes, they're great. They can go many distances, but music, if and when you're ready, actually it could trigger something far deeper. So maybe lessons could do that too.
I believe so. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about lessons from Nightingales here in a bit, but just to get some background on you, I read that you grew up not only in Turkey but also in Cyprus. I
Mhm.
wonder how you think about the relation of these two geographies as they relate to your musical upbringing. Were you exposed to different musics in these two different places? How do they relate, interrelate, not relate? I wonder if you can speak to that.
Well, yes, of course. So, Loki, I guess my history prepared me to some sort of a multicultural life because my parents are both from Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. They're Turkish Cypriots, and so, but they were born and raised during a period when Cyprus was governed by the British. It was a colony of the United Kingdom. So my parents initially were Brits. They were basically British, and then the Republic of Cyprus was formed in 1960. So they became quote unquote Cypriots, if you will, and then but they were Turkish Cypriots, and then the island went through. The island was already going through some turmoil, and then unfortunately, a couple years after the founding of the Republic of Cyprus, there was more strife and conflict, and because my father's mother's side, my paternal grandmother, were actually Turkish from the mainland Turkey, that is from Istanbul. So eventually, my dad came to Istanbul. He studied to become a medical doctor and then married my mom. My mom moved to Turkey as well. I was born in Istanbul, but then of course, and uh, ever since I was like 1 years old, we would go to Cyprus every summer, stay there for 3 months, etc. I did live on the island for 1 year during sixth grade, and
Hmm.
that was with my grandmother, maternal grandmother. And then, but so my ties to the island are very strong. My dad, now let's get to the multicultural side of it. It's not just the British side of it. Of course, the island is now a divided island. Once it wasn't, and Greeks and Turks lived together. I'm not going to say harmoniously. I don't think that such coexistence never existed anywhere on this planet.
Mm.
People only tolerate each other. That's and basically the level of tolerance can be higher or lower, and sometimes none. But if you look at the United States or many other places, in the world, it's all about tolerance.
Hmm.
And only some individuals transcend that. But to draw pictures of communities transcending, those kinds of, borders is actually, in my opinion, uh, nothing but utopian. So, in any case, but my dad spoke Greek fluently. In fact, my both my grandfathers and one grandmother, they all speak Greek fluently. My dad even went to elementary school, Greek elementary school. He knew how to read and write as well. He knew a lot of Greek songs. I grew up in Turkey in a household, therefore, that would speak of Cyprus, that would speak of British cultural legacy, and there would be a lot of Greek songs, etc.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there would be all this political talk and about conflict and so on. So, it was an interesting childhood.
When you talk about people tolerating each other, I can't help but to think about tolerating certain types of music. I wonder if you can speak to the musical cultural implications of this multiculturalism. So, was there a tolerance of the Western European classical over the more traditional music? Maybe that was flip flopped. I wonder if you can speak to that.
Sure. Well, Loki, not so much a tolerance because that part of the world, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, etc., have been subject to a form of, westernization that has also, of course, for a long time imposed a sense of superiority of
Hmm.
Western musics, especially, of course, Western classical music.
Right.
Therefore, a lot of the people in that part of the world have become self-orientalized. Therefore, lots of people, that come from those parts of the world, including myself, some years back, I would champion Western forms of music over any kind of Middle Eastern music. It took me a long time to actually reconnect with my roots in a genuine fashion and reconstruct my identity. So, if anything, my parents, to this day, I mean, we lost my dad 10 years ago, but my mom is still alive, and to this day, I think she would be an ardent supporter of Western classical music being a superior type of music, and my dad was certainly of that had that stance, and that's just the reality. But then, of course, people, the say, for example, classical Ottoman Turkish music didn't evaporate; it
Hmm.
still remains, but it had to defend itself against that kind of superiority inferiority kind of comparison, and that wasn't necessarily we cannot say that it did not have an effect on that music as well,
Hmm.
even if it was a defensive kind of pushback. But these are complicated matters, and they I can talk about them on and on and on, but I hope this conveys some sense.
I'm curious to know if there was a specific event or a thought process that triggered what you're describing as the reconstruction of your identity.
Oh yeah, the event is very funny though. It's very funny because one night we were playing the board game of Risk with my friends. Of
Sure.
course, this is 20. Let's see. Okay, this is like this is exactly the year 2000, and I think it was February, so 25 years ago, when I was still a young person. so we were playing this game of Risk, which is a board game that can last for several hours. At the time, we're talking, of course, internet connections via modems, right?
Hmm.
And so a friend of mine wanted to make a joke, and he, without telling us, started downloading so-called Ottoman Janissary band musics,
Right.
right? Because Risk is a battle war game, whatever. And
Hmm.
so, so he's going to download those and he's going to play them, and we're all going to laugh, which is exactly what happened. He started playing them, and we were like, ha 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 ha. But because modem, dial-up connections at the time, they were slow, so it would take a long time for these songs to download. And he asked, "Do you want me to turn it off?" We said, "No, no, no. Let it play along in the background." So what happened was, um, the game is long. So within about a couple of hours, something happened that had not happened up until that point in my life, which is these self-orientalist filters that I had put in place started subconsciously going away because I'm a musician.
Hmm.
And at that time, I had completed a master's degree at New England Conservatory and was accepted to a doctoral degree in composition at the same institution. I was a bit full of myself. Come on, and so basically, you know. Uh, as a musician with those kinds of skills, of course, just subconsciously, I started listening to this music, kind of with an analytical ear. And there were two pieces that threw me off. I couldn't tell where the tonic was.
Hmm.
And one of them, especially because it was a kind of a vertically hidden tonic. And I just couldn't tell it. And can you imagine? I mean, I grew up there like for 18 years, when I came to the United States, I was 18 years old, and it's not like I never went back. I would go back every summer and stay long, And I was like, I can't even tell the tonic of a simple folk song from where I came from. Of course, this was an exceptionally interesting mode, and everything, but still, it was a
Hmm.
folk song. So it's like someone pulled the rug under my feet and I landed on my butt, It was like, and you know, that just basically that put me on a decade long intense study of Turkish musics and culture and reconstruction of my identity.
Now, when we talk about the superimposed superiority of
Yeah.
Western music in this conversation, I do want to acknowledge that there are Western musics that I would argue don't fall into those categories, namely jazz or what we call jazz. Before we jump back into lessons from Nightingales, I wonder if there are similarities that we should be thinking about when we talk about this Turkish music, specifically regarding improvisation. Improvisation isn't exclusive to jazz, but surely the two forms in your studies have informed how you realize those ideas.
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, to answer or to respond to the first part of your statement, one can talk about two histories of jazz. One that is more European and even after the 70s Middle Eastern, meaning existence of jazz, for example, in Europe and especially after a certain point in European jazz festivals, the way that music is cast in that part of the world is very different from its presence here, and has been very different. And so it's very strange because for example, in Istanbul, the image of jazz is one of that is very upper class,
Hmm.
which is extremely different from its history here, and that is an important point, though. But again, this is a whole other conversation. Okay, but I did want to kind of, because again, my connection to jazz, of course, initially was under that kind of an image,
Hmm.
and so my mom was a classical piano teacher. I grew up more with Chopin, Mozart, and Beethoven. And then, however, I kind of had a rebellion, and I started playing in progressive rock bands, and then I connected with jazz very quickly, and I wanted to come to the United States. And in 1993 I came to Berklee College of Music, which was at the time still a jazz school. It
Hmm.
is not anymore, but at the time it was, and I was lucky enough to catch the last of the uh, great jazz icons still teaching, like Bob Brookmeyer, George Russell, some giants. And I was lucky enough to work with Paul Bley, John Abercrombie, all of these guys. And so for a while, I was nothing but a jazz musician, and one very, very dedicated and devoted. But I always had this classical side, and I always considered myself first and foremost a composer. And so I think that desire slowly started moving me toward concert music composition.
Hmm.
But again, eventually, basically, I got to my doctorate as a concert music composer. And strangely enough, right at that time, I connected with Turkish music, blah, 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 blah. But to get back to that improvisation idea, yes, I was always an improviser. I shouldn't say always. I mean, ever since I started playing in those rock bands and jazz, I'm a good improviser. I have that ability, and somehow, therefore, improvising in Turkish musics,
Mhm.
was easy. Was natural to me. They are they're different. They're related. They're different. They're related. They're not the same, but they are. You can. Once you internalize these different musical languages, I think you can see overlaps and differences, and that has been a good part of my life story.
And speaking of these overlaps on lessons from Nightingales, of course the Turkish traditions are to the front, but there's Japanese musical traditions involved, some even some Western European. I wonder what inspired your bringing in these non-Turkish traditions into this project.
That's an excellent question, and it gives me the opportunity to address an important part. I am very cautious and aware about uh, appropriations and so on and so forth. So for me to touch anything beyond Turkish jazz and different types of concert music slash some forms of early music is always an issue of extreme consciousness. I have delved into uh, influences where I drew from gamelan, for example, Javanese gamelan in one or two instances, and in this case, gagaku, Japanese court music. And believe me, I have questioned it 100,000 times before I felt like, okay, I'm going to do it. First of all, I felt that the way I'm bringing the influence is much more structural, and it is in fact not a direct quotation or anything.
Mhm.
But second of all, I did study it a lot, and it wasn't just prior to this composition, but for several decades. Not necessarily like internalizing Turkish music. It was much more so in the vicinity of ethnomusicology. I'll admit
Sure.
to that. But the person that I am, the sensitivities that I have toward these issues, and I had to lecture about it in certain kinds of ethnomusicology courses that I teach at the New England Conservatory. So with that kind of background, I felt that the kind of uh, inspiration that I drew and created what I did in the first movement of this piece, I felt comfortable enough doing. So there you go. You have my confession on that on record. Anything beyond that, with whether it's European early music influences, polyphony wise, or Turkish music influences, modality wise, etc. Those are languages that I own. I own them. I am,
Mhm.
in fact, I don't want to brag about myself. I don't like doing that, but I will say I'm one of the few composers, musicians out there who happens to be fluent in, three or so different musical languages, a variety of Turkish musics, jazz, and a variety of, European musics, I'd say.
We spend a lot of time exploring the baggage that surrounds the phrase classical music, but you're making me think about the same as it relates to the phrase early music with your use of that phrase. When we say early music, we're typically talking about, uh, you know, church music of Western Europe many centuries ago. What's your response to lessons from Nightingales also being categorized as early music, considering that it's so different than the Bach and the medieval chants that we typically associate with that phrase?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mean, the early music association there is, of course, because of Blue Heron, the ensemble, the vocal ensemble that commissioned the work, and would they do perform a lot of well, sacred and some secular songs too from the medieval and Renaissance period, and so that's their expertise, and they have a sound, they have an approach to that kind of repertoire that is very much their own. And so with this kind of a commission, I knew that I was going to honor that early polyphony, which is something that I love anyway,
Hmm.
and so it was a golden opportunity. But at the same time, uh, I was I knew that I was going to throw in there Turkish modalities and find and create a work that was going to bring these different strands of modalities and polyphony together. And of course, I can't help it. Every now and then, jazz finds its way in there. It's
Hmm.
not explicitly, stated, but there are times when it will certain harmonic colors, etc. You'll hear it. And again, there are other things too, like we noted, like Japanese gagaku and so on and so forth. So, uh, but um, early music, of course, its inherent problem is that it is a kind of a reinvented tradition.
Hmm.
It survived, and so unlike other musics, for example, classical Turkish music, uh, that musical tradition doesn't consider its history to be broken. It considers its chain to be continuous, and it does have an oral tradition too. Therefore, when you improvise, within that tradition, you find a master, a teacher, and you learn from them, and they convey to you, what is the last form of that tradition that continued. With so-called early European music, it's not like that. It's been a revived tradition, mostly based on manuscripts, etc., or other documentation, and so it kind of created its quote unquote oral tradition, from documentation. So that is a problematic, of course, revival.
Hmm.
But you know, also it is also true that that movement brought forth sounds that were forgotten. We have these instruments, we have these timbres, we have these temperaments, different divisions of the octave. So with all of its problems, still now we have these alternative worlds of sonic, music, and so that's those are the benefits of it. And but it has its problems, of course.
What sort of learning, or were you involved in any teaching and preparation of the actual performers? I wonder what context they needed to accurately bring this music to life.
Oh, for in other words, in lessons from Nightingales.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, right. So the percussionists and myself, I was playing the ney, the end blown flute, and there was a tambour player, a bowed tambour player. Those four people, we were very much aware, and we know Turkish music and a variety of Western musics. The bow tambour player is, in fact, the violin player, and
Mhm.
who happens to have studied Turkish music for a long time, etc. So, and the percussionists are both. One of them is a jazz drummer, but also plays, a Turkish percussion. The other one is from Palestine, and so and has been exposed to concert music, percussion, etc. So those people were much more ready and be able to engage in different worlds of music. Uh, the vocal ensemble Blue Heron was very much open
Mhm.
to engaging in all kinds of ways, but I, as a composer, am realistic. And so I write music when I'm placed in these situations. I write it so that I'm not asking anything that is unrealistic. I won't write music for a string orchestra and ask them, well, now try to find this Turkish microtone that is supposed to be blah blah. And, that's there are some composers who put arrows, but I think those arrows should be for certain effects.
Mm.
But Turkish music, if you're talking Turkish music, Greek music, etc., those are not effects. They're very distinct pitches. They are flavors. They're like the blues.
Hmm.
If you don't know the blues, like saxophone teachers, etc., jazz musicians, they'll be like, man, that doesn't sound blue enough or whatever, and they would try to get you to hear it and to be able to internalize it. So how am I going to get a group of people in a vocal ensemble or a string, or however good they may be, if their instruments do not have those flavors readily available to them
Hmm.
mechanically, I can't get them to hear it, period. So I'm not going to engage in that. There are other ways, and I really do believe that there are other ways of conveying emotion. Again, I have internalized these languages, and so I tend to be able to hear or translate. That's what I call myself, by the way. I'm a good musical translator because to be able to translate a joke, you don't go word by word and
Hmm.
translate it. Then it will lose its meaning. It will no longer make you laugh in this other language. You have to actually find the same sense and find a joke that says it completely differently. And because I know these different languages, I can do that.
Hmm.
And so I look for that often, and hopefully, I mean, I in this composition, I know that I'm very proud of it. I know that I have on and on in different movements found these ways to convey these different ways, and I of course found all ways to have, for example, the ney and the tambour float on top of certain shapes without interrupting us, and us without interrupting them, and so on and so forth. And then there are times when we can totally be together, because of course there are modes that I know which are going to go both ways, and so on and so forth.
Can you talk about what the vocalists are singing? Are these
Mm,
texts,
mm,
poetry? Yeah,
mm.
want to speak to that.
Sure. The Triumph, the piece that has the instruments, uh, well, for all pieces on the album, the Devran and the Triumph. Devran is a cappella, and the other one is with kind of a chamber ensemble. Um, they both have Sufi poems. I set to Sufi poems to music in both cases. The Triumph has a Bektashi Sufi poem. Bektashis are a Turkish Sufi order. And then the second one is most likely a Mevlevi Sufi poetry. Mevlevis are the so-called whirling dervishes, also specifically Turkish Sufi order. And I mean, they are, of course, a very they have complicated philosophies that they preach.
Hmm.
Maybe they run less so. The Triumph definitely talks about or tries to get at the philosophy of unity of existence, unity of the being. These kinds of Sufi philosophies that are um, certainly a far cry from the mainstream.
Interesting, really interesting. Is there context that listeners can explore to get an even deeper understanding
Well,
of what you've created?
yeah, I would certainly recommend, looking up the Bektashi Sufi order, the Mevlevi Sufi order. Just go beyond Rumi. As amazing as Rumi is, of course, these orders have developed a certain philosophy, rituals, as we noted earlier, and practices. So just by looking up those two orders, and reading about them would go a long way.
In my composer advocacy work, I've had the privilege of many times seeing composers hear their piece of music realized for the first time. And more often than not, that first reading, that first listen triggers many, many changes in the piece of music. I wonder what you remember about the first time you were hearing this actually performed and if that inspired changes that ultimately made it to the album.
Sure. Well, this is not a point of pride, but this particular time, I didn't change a note.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm saying that it's not, a point of pride because I mean it can be because I didn't. It was the dots I put on the page and they remained the same. But like for example, with this, and I wrote the piece fairly quickly. I think I wrote it in about 3 weeks or so. With the score typed up and everything. So that's for a 25-minute piece, the Triumph, that's record breaking speed. But uh, there, like for example, just a couple of weeks ago, I had a, commission for violin piano piece, much shorter, like 12, 13-minute long piece. And like for example, I am going to revise the third movement of that. And I think it was because even though I guess both were rushed, like that one was even more rushed, and so I feel like okay, I do want to revise that. So there could be revision process. That's perfectly fine, but in this case, it was exactly what I put on the page. In terms of what I felt as it was coming up, well, the very first movement when we first started running it, there was this couple of, I don't know, maybe the first 10 minutes was rough.
Hmm.
Suddenly these sound worlds coming together. Let's be real for a quick second here. A choir that is, it's not even a choir, vocal ensemble, just 13 singers. It's not a large ensemble or large choir. So that's not a lot of noise, okay?
Right.
And you're putting a lot of percussion next to it. So first of all, that's unusual, and the percussion can really compete. And how are we going to place the choir? And it wasn't easy. And so the first 10 minutes or so was a bit chaotic. But once people started settling into their positions, the percussion started kind of adjusting their dynamics, then it started going. And I mean, we had, I think, like two rehearsals, and of course, the ensemble separately had more rehearsals, and again, like maybe two more,
Hmm.
but yeah, two rehearsals and a dress rehearsal, and then we had the we just played one concert, and essentially a day after the concert, we recorded the piece over two pieces over 3 days. That's it. That's what this was about.
Something else that I've had the privilege of understanding and working with so many composers is that the only thing more difficult than getting a new piece performed for a first time is getting it performed a second time. I
That's
wonder if I wonder if Lessons from Nightingales is something that you think is replicatable, or does it really only exist in the way that it's been recorded?
Well, I mean, of course, I would love for it to get, second, third, fourth performances. Some of my music does get that, and that feels fantastic. Sometimes I guess a composer such as myself faces this dilemma of, whether to write music for forces that's going to be really unique,
Hmm.
but it's going to limit the chances of the music getting performed, later. This was one such occasion, and it just came up and about that way. You know, I am calling for percussion instruments that are not easily and readily available everywhere. I'm calling for a ney player and a bow tambour player. So yes, that is a bit of a challenge for it to be performed again. But it's also not super crazy. but it does limit. It's not like any choir can pick it up and be able to say, well, we can hire the ney player, that lives
Right.
down the block. So there is that there, and I do give these things, good enough thought, but I also have to say, Loki, uh, in most cases, when people commission me, they do come to me with, because they know that I have that kind of versatility, and so they're like, Mehmet, we'd love to have something that where you bring this color, etc. Sometimes I tell them, I can bring that uh, feeling without having to bring instruments or other instruments, etc. And in fact, on Lessons from Nightingales, there's Devran. It's a cappella work, and I do believe it is a testament that it can be done. I mean, it really does, have um, the same sense, and that is a cappella that could be performed. That other vocal ensembles and choirs can perform it. Now it is difficult. it's 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 um, it's actually my music tends to have this quality. It tends to look easy on paper, and then when you attempt to sing it, perform it, it can be a little difficult. But it is doable, and I've had a couple of performances of Devran for sure.
Any words on the title of this work? Any significance of the phrase "lessons from Nightingales"?
Well, it directly comes out of the one of the poems, the one in Devran. Actually, it is one of the lines in one of the quatrains. It says, uh, "Nightingales keep reciting lessons," and so it was Scott Metcalf, the director of Blue Heron, who actually was like, "This line is great. Let's put." And then I said, well, we should also have a subtitle, and that's where we went to songs of Sufi mysteries. So because I wanted to emphasize Sufism and mystery, because especially because of the triumph,
Right.
yeah, that piece, the poetry of that is all about Sufi mystery. So yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, how can people learn more about you and check out this album?
My website is soundlacol.com. It's my last name, soundlacol.com. And if they get on there, my newsletter email list will pop up, and they can sign up, and they can, get updates about concerts and recordings and so on. And also they can get a hold of this recording. I mean, it's everywhere. It's streaming everywhere, Spotify, Apple, but also on Bandcamp, on Blue Heron's Bandcamp page. They can buy. It's a gorgeous CD. The cover art is beautiful, and the booklet has all kinds of information about the pieces and Sufism and everything.
Wonderful. And any new compositions that you're working on now that you can share? Any seedlings that you can talk about?
Yes, luckily I do have a couple of commissions on my desk. And strangely enough, and this really doesn't happen all that often, but another early music group actually approached me, and the next commission on my desk is that Boston Baroque approached me, and they wanted me to write something again that would be in this case maybe 15-20 minutes long composition, and not for the whole Baroque orchestra, but this would be for a quartet plus an organ, and I was the one who actually requested or insisted on a Baroque organ, a chamber organ, because I really wanted to explore a different type of temperament. uh, I love these period temperaments. They're so much closer to my Turkish ears,
Hmm.
and I love that kind of early Baroque sound. Anyway, I mean, okay, one confession. I another confession. It's very hard for me to listen to early Baroque on equal temperament.
Mm.
Just because once I heard early Baroque music on mean tone tempered instruments, it just sounds so different. And again, those sensibilities these wider half steps and so on. They so are attuned, or in tune with my Turkish sensibilities. So it's difficult for me to go back.
Well, we look forward to hearing what's coming. So,
Thank you.
where I wanted to close, we've been talking
Okay.
a lot about multiculturalism. There's a Boston Globe quote on your website that says the multiculturalism is not touristy, but rather sophisticated, informed, internalized. I wonder what guidance you would give to composers who want to utilize what we're referring to as multiculturalism in their music and to keep
Mhm.
it, again, as the Boston Globe has noted about your music, sophisticated and informed.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for bringing that up. I really appreciate that because I do believe that what Mehmet Ali Sanlıkol brings to the table as a composer, among so many talented, gifted composers that are out there, is in fact a kind of internalized, multicultural, multi-musical form of concert music composition.
Hmm.
Like I said earlier, I mean, that really is who I am. And I do strongly believe that an album like Lessons from Nightingales, a composition like The Triumph, is unique, especially because of that. And I will also say there are different grades of existence on this palette of being bi-musical or multi-musical. You can. I mean, I don't necessarily am gonna demand from all musicians and or composers to internalize these multiple musical languages that they're working with. But I do want to say, please practice the kind of awareness and consciousness that I have described. For example, that I put myself through with, say, Japanese gagaku.
Hmm.
At least that is possible, but it cannot be right when you get a commission. And if it has to be that, then you have to make sure, or limit your the way you're kind of conveying whatever you're bringing in, limit it to a smaller scope, so that, because in the end, it is really all about how much you can internalize. To me, the most ideal form of multimusicality is, in fact, when you do internalize fully, one or two or more musical languages. That means actually stopping everything you do and studying that other music. You're gonna have to play it. You're gonna have to sing it. And you're gonna have to do that for a couple of years. That is the ultimate form. There's no question about it. I've done it. I paid the price. I became an older person as doing it. That's the price you pay, because, while other people were climbing up the ladder of professional career, I was, trying to learn the oud and trying to learn the ney, and trying to perform these musics on stage. That studentship was necessary for the kind of music to result on Lessons from Nightingales, or another album, another composition like A Gentleman of Istanbul. That's what I had to go through. But I also recognize it's not black or white. There are different shades of gray here. But those are even more difficult. You need to be super conscious and super aware, because it falls on us, the composers, the musicians. It doesn't fall on the audience. What do they know? Come on, we're talking about sophisticated music here. It falls on us to guide the people. If we don't guide them properly, what chance do people have? What chance do even critics have? Come on. I'm going to get real here, because what chance does some, really good concert music critic have when they listen to some seriously classical Turkish music inspired music? What do they know about classical Ottoman Turkish music?
Hmm.
Nothing. Nothing. They know nothing. So I have to provide the guidance to them. And then, like you noted, Loki, earlier, jazz. These worlds, even though they seem to coexist here, they're still heavily divided. Let's get real. And so it falls on us. Let's the composers, the musicians, why don't we become more, let's own up to what we have to own up to. Let's really do our job. Let's just lead the people in the best way we can. That's keeping up the good fight. So that's what I'm going to preach, for everyone listening. Um, and at the same time, we're human beings. We all do mistakes, and when that happens, let's own up to our mistakes too.
And that's how the album ends. A beautiful feature there of the Blue Heron Choir to conclude Lessons from Nightingales. Huge thanks to Mehmet for taking the time to chat with me, to the folks at Blue Heron, and everyone that helped make this album possible, and of course to Stuart over at The Unfinished Side for connecting us. Be sure to go listen to this album and to learn a little bit about this tradition. I think I mentioned it in my chat with Mehmet, but I first got into music connected with Sufism at my first radio job down at WUOT. I was looking for something to air to honor the aesthetics and traditions of West Asia, and that's when I started learning about Sufism through that medium. It was a different album, but a culture that I wasn't familiar with, but one that I'm glad to now be familiar with. I also mentioned that when I was first developing our relationship with the guy at our neighborhood deli here in New York, the Ak, as folks here might say, he for some reason assumed that I was Sufi. So it's kind of cool how this has always been at the peripheral of a lot of my work and my life. So go expand your knowledge about the world with Lessons from Nightingales. I definitely recommend and give it my stamp of approval. Okay, so we come back over to the world of opera for today's Trilloquy. Back on November 21st, 2025, a group of climate protesters disrupted a performance of Carmen at the Metropolitan Opera. I believe two of them were immediately arrested and one got away, but the following day, a statement was released by one of the protesters, and there's a link to that statement in the description of this opus if you would like to take a look. This event made it into my consciousness, as many things do, thanks to social media. There was an opera singer on my feed complaining about this and talking about how it doesn't really do any good. The protesters were standing against David Koch, who died in 2019 for his abuses against the government and how his holdings and his company has contributed negatively to climate change. So the hall where ballet happens over at Lincoln Center is named after him. But I guess the protesters figured going over to where the opera takes place at Lincoln Center would be good enough. Or maybe they thought all of Lincoln Center was funded by David Koch. I'm not sure. Either way, they made it to the stage, stopped the performance, and gave us something to talk about. About us, I mean the entire field. Everyone has opinions, as I'm sure you can imagine, and maybe you hold opinions as well. But for me, this one is a little complicated. I can't immediately jump on one side or the other. I guess I can start by saying I don't see myself as being the Mets' target audience or a part of their target workforce. So it's relatively easy for me to play armchair quarterback on this one, but I am sensitive to the ways in which this impacts artists. As for the opera, they interrupted. It's one of the most famous in the genre, Carmen, and among those that perpetuate the normalization of femicide in opera, if you're familiar with the story. I've played the music from Carmen more times than I could tell you, but my first time actually watching it from an audience perspective was a few years ago with Lady Jess down at the Washington National Opera. So shout out to Lady Jess. If you don't know, the opera ends with the male lead forcing himself on Carmen and killing her because she's chosen another man. So disrupting something like that isn't something I'm positioned to push back on, if I'm going to be honest. I believe that we have to stop acting like the experience of enjoying an opera has to come with some sort of trauma, has to include violence against women or the marginalized, has to include rape and murder, even if it's fictional. And this isn't me justifying the protesters' actions. I'm just saying that I'm not going to bend over backwards to wag my finger at anyone who's critical of that tradition and does what they can to disrupt it in their own way. And then there's the audience to consider. Those folks pay good money, many of whom are regular working class people. So it's not necessarily fair to them for their experience to be interrupted, but it's also not fair that corporations like those supported by David Koch contributed to the climate change that's displacing people around the world and creating more volatile weather patterns that adversely affect people. Again, like I said, it's complicated. I could ramble on for a long time, but at the end of the day, protesters saw that space as one that's run by billions of dollars to entertain the wealthy. And for me, that's that's really where I think we should be centering the conversation. Folks who champion quote unquote traditional opera and opera spaces need to think about how this perception can be changed, because it isn't just wealthy people in those spaces. It's all of us. And that's what institutions are working to further guide, making sure that audiences are more diverse and more representative of society at large. But those protesters, again, really thought they were poking and prodding the rich by protesting in that space. Opera has a perception issue that it just needs to engage. That's what I think we can learn from this. I even had a conversation with a Met Orchestra musician one time who said that all people deserve an elevated experience, like enjoying an opera at the Met. He used that word elevated. This is not how we grow and diversify audiences, by proclaiming it as an elevated experience. Elevated over what is really my question. Yes, there are many fur coats and ascots and everything else in the crowd, folks who actually are a part of that 1%, but you can't burn the building down with the baby in it, right? On the protest side of things, I think there's some intentionality that needs to be engaged as well. First of all, again, they were at the wrong building. It's actually the ballet theater that was funded by David Koch. So you got to have the right context on what and who you're protesting against if you're going to do something like that. But I think we also need to talk about outcomes. I don't believe that stopping an opera performance, even Carmen, as violent as it is against women, engages climate justice in the way that they hope. It just pisses off a bunch of people. And again, I've made it clear that operas like Carmen aren't ones that I support. So I'm not caping for the system in any way. I'm just trying to point out the fact that there are meaningful ways to engage that keep the conversation going and agitate the right people. And I'm partially preaching to myself, because this sort of protest is something that I would have been in full support of back in the day. But today, I don't really have a problem, I guess, but I do believe that it's more of a stunt than a way to actually get something done. And, some people are here for the stunts, and that's fine. If that was the goal, mission accomplished. But it's my sense that the goal is something broader than simply agitating. It's about actually inspiring change toward positive motion against where we're taking our planet right now. And I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I do know that these are climate protesters. So that's, that's the information I have to work with. All in all, I think we should continue to be critical of the financial and artistic systems that perpetuate status quo, both in and outside of the arts. And we have to focus our energies, including our protests, on things that will give us what we're actually seeking. I want to see people engage the concept of classical music in a broader way. So instead of making a scene at a performance, I support artists who are bringing something different to the table. That's how I figured it out for myself, and you got to figure it out for yourself, because it takes a diversity of tactics for all of us to be successful and for all of us to see a tomorrow, certainly our planet. Again, if it's your goal to make noise and agitate for the sake of agitating, well, I have no critiques. Do that. But understand that there is work beyond the agitation that actually outlines the point of it all that we can't forget about. Those are my words to those protesters and to anyone out there looking to resist the status quo of classical music and everything that surrounds it. All right, I think that's it for for today. Appreciate you as always for listening, and I'll have another one for you here soon. Until then, thanks.